Well, the problem with the elk reserve, aside from the fact that even Park Service policies say that no wild animal shall be kept confined, um, the biggest problem with keeping elk there is that there's not adequate water, and that's why half of the 500 elk that died during the drought died. Those ponds, some of them at least, that the elk depend on for water because there's no perennial streams there, are only rain fed, and so they do dry up during droughts. And in fact, even spring fed and seep fed ponds can and do dry up during droughts, but they do last longer. At some point, if it's not raining, there's nothing to recharge a spring or a seep, so those ponds dry up slower and later, but they still ultimately dry up. And that's the problem with keeping the elk locked up at Pierce Point. It's an unnatural condition, and it's doomed to failure because there's not adequate water in times of stress.
How many cows died during that drought?
Well, of course, no cows died and no elk died outside that 2,600 acres of fenced land because they all had adequate water. The Park Service did not take any steps to provide water in that time of the drought. And in fact, the Park Service's position was, which I think it later regretted saying, was that these are wild animals and they have to be left to their own devices. And the answer is no, they were not wild animals. They're animals that are kept in a captive condition. 2,600 acres is just a 2,600 acre zoo. If you're going to confine them, you have to give them food and water and make sure that they have it at all times. If you leave them there and don't give them water and the drought dries up the water, you've killed them yourself.
Mm-hmm. And so they considered it an act of animal husbandry, but it also just so happens that the part of the land where the elk reserve is has a shortage of water sources.
Yes, there. I know. I don't know all the ponds. There are about 6 or 8 ponds there, and the one that I'm most familiar with, that's close to the road before you get to the ranch complex, is one that is fed by a seep, but it did dry up totally during the drought. You can see where elk stood you can see their hoof prints in the seep as they were trying to drink water from the seep, which involved basically drinking some dirt as well. I met a man who told me that he saw during the drought a dead elk that had a mouth full of dried dirt, which I believe was its way of trying to get the last bit of moisture it could by putting the wet mud in its mouth and trying to get as much of the contents of the water in the mud as possible, and it wasn't enough to keep it alive.
That paints a pretty grisly picture of what their last days were like.